Hi, I'm Father Jim Forson, and I'd like to offer you some reflections on the gospel of this 12th Sunday in Ordinary Time. There was a book a while back and a movie by the same title, The Life of Pi, about a young man named Pi who, with his family, was moving their zoo by boat from one country to another. And as they were at sea, a terrible storm came up and it swamped the boat and it sank, killing everyone aboard. And only Pi was able to survive, and he swam to this lifeboat that had also survived the wreck, and he climbed aboard, and he thought himself to be utterly alone. Everyone that he knew and loved had died, and he was lost on this huge ocean. But he came to discover that under the canvas on this lifeboat, there was hidden this ferocious tiger named Richard Parker. And he had to spend his time at sea waiting to be rescued, contending with this tiger for weeks. And through it, he wrote down these words: "Even when God seemed to have abandoned me, he was watching. Even when he seemed indifferent to my suffering, he was watching. And when I was beyond all hope of saving, he gave me rest. He gave me a sign to continue my journey. Richard Parker, the tiger, my fierce companion, the terrible one who kept me alive." Do we ever find ourselves now, or maybe sometime in the past, with a fierce companion? It could be something that we are struggling with, or something that is even threatening our very lives, an addiction, or a terrible disease or illness that we have, or maybe the death of someone whom we loved. It could even be on a larger scale, something going on in the country where there's terrible political unrest and uncertainty, or there's war, or whatever the problem that might be presenting itself, and it's tearing us apart. And when we find ourselves in those moments with that fierce companion, what is it that we say to God? Make this go away. Well, that certainly was what the disciples were feeling, where we hear in the gospel they were caught up in a storm in the Sea of Galilee, and they were frightened for their lives. Now remember, many of them were seasoned sailors, and so they were used to storms. The fact that they were afraid for their lives meant that this was no ordinary storm. This was huge. And fearing they were dying, they were astounded by Jesus, who was asleep in the stern of the boat on a cushion. Now, they knew who they had on board. This was the miracle worker. They had seen him cure the leper and drive out the demons and multiply the loaves and the fishes. They knew who they had, and they woke him up and said, "Don't you care about the fact that we are about to perish?" And Jesus calmed the waters. And then he said to them, "Don't you have any faith?" And by faith, he didn't mean, "Don't you believe I'm divine?" By faith, what he meant was personal commitment or loyalty. Another way of putting that question is, don't you have any loyalty to me the way that I do to you? He was asking the disciples the question that he asks us: who am I to you? That's a question that we all have to answer for ourselves. Because when we find ourselves in the middle of a storm, in the middle of a struggle, what is it that we expect God to do? To accompany us through that storm? Or to calm the waters? What do we expect him to be? A miracle worker? Because one thing is certain: when we are in that struggle, We either will want God to be with us through it, or we'll expect Him to be that miracle worker. And if He doesn't calm the seas, well then, what good is He? One thing is certain, that struggle will either bring us closer to God and to a deeper understanding of Him, or it will be the source of our great divorce from Him. Who needs Him? In the book, that young man, Pi, came to realize that that tiger was sent to him by God, and that through all of those struggles that he had in trying to stay alive himself and not be killed by this animal, that it really was a gift that God gave him, because without that tiger, he doubted that he would ever even survive or find a reason to stay alive. The disciples, too, had the exact same response. In time, they would realize that through that storm, and then later in life with other struggles, the crucifixion of Christ and the ending of what they thought was all of their hope, and then eventually their own martyrdom, as they would go through all of those fierce companions, they came to no longer call out to Jesus to calm the waters, to be a miracle worker, but rather to be with them in their journey. And you know, the older I get, the more that makes sense to me. I mean, there's sometimes when I still want a miracle worker. I want to poke Jesus when I see somebody who's suffering terribly, or when I'm having a bad time, and I want to wake him up and say, hey, do something. I get that. But I tell you, the older I get, the more I have come to realize that I have learned more about God and about my relationship with Him in the midst of my struggles with my terrible companions, my fierce companion. That has taught me more about God than any miracle ever has. And so I get it when it's written, even when God seemed to have abandoned me, He was watching. Even when He seemed indifferent to my suffering, He was watching. He gave me a sign to continue. My fierce companion, the terrible one that kept me alive. It is in the middle of that struggle that God says to us, I am here. Is that enough for us?